The stars had never frightened humanity. That was the problem, at least from the perspective of every other civilization watching from a careful distance. In the year 2289, human beings had been traveling between star systems for just under 90 years. In that time, they had built colonies on 14 worlds, established mining operations on 62 moons and asteroid belts, and planted military outposts at the edge of 11 different star systems. They had done all of this without asking anyone for permission. They had done it the way they did most things, quickly, loudly, and with total confidence that the universe was simply waiting to be used. Other civilizations had taken centuries to reach what humans had done in less than one. The Velhari, a species with smooth gray skin and eyes the color of deep water, had spent 400 years debating the ethical implications of interstellar expansion before placing their first colony ship into orbit. The Oshari had taken 300 years. The Council itself, a body formed by 43 species to manage the shared space between their territories, had rules, very old, very detailed rules, about how expansion was supposed to happen. There were zones designated as quiet. There were corridors reserved for neutral travel. There were territories that required permission, registration, and a waiting period that could last decades. Humanity had read none of these rules. Or rather, humanity had read them, noted them, filed them somewhere, and then continued building anyway. Ambassador Diane Cole was not a reckless woman. She was 54 years old, with short silver hair and the kind of calm that comes from spending 30 years managing situations that were always one wrong word away from falling apart. She had negotiated trade agreements with 3 non-council civilizations, had represented Earth during the Kepler Corridor boundary dispute, and had once talked a mining consortium out of drilling on a site that a regional species considered sacred ground. She was good at her job. She believed genuinely that most problems between intelligent beings came down to a failure of communication, and that most failures of communication could be fixed with patience and good listening. She was reading the transmission from the Galactic Council for the 3rd time when Colonel Nathan Price knocked on the frame of her office door and stepped inside without waiting for an answer. Price was 47, built like a man who had spent decades in low gravity and then compensated aggressively, with a square jaw and dark eyes that had the habit of finding the exits before they found the person speaking to him. He was her military advisor. He was also, in Diane's private assessment, the most quietly dangerous person she had ever met, not because he was violent, but because he thought about violence the way an engineer thinks about a structure, calmly, practically, and always ahead of the problem. "You've read it," she said. "Twice," he said. He sat down in the chair across from her desk without being invited, which was something he always did and which she had stopped mentioning 3 years ago. He folded his hands in his lap and looked at the window behind her for a moment before looking back. "They didn't ask us to come," he said. "They told us to come." "I noticed," she said. "There's a difference." "I know there's a difference, Nathan." He nodded once and did not push it further. That was another thing about Price. He said a thing once, clearly, and then he let it sit. He did not repeat himself. He trusted that the other person had heard him. If they chose to ignore it, that was their decision, and he would deal with the consequences when they arrived. The transmission was formal and long. It cited 17 specific incidents over the past 11 years in which human activity had violated Council protocols. It listed the border skirmish near the Arvon corridor, the incident 6 months ago in which a human patrol cutter had responded to a weapons lock from a Council enforcement vessel by opening fire and disabling it, as the most recent and most serious offense. It stated that the Galactic Council required the presence of a human delegation at Caravax Prime within 30 days. It did not say what would happen if the delegation did not appear. It did not need to. The language made the implied threat very clear. Dr. Alan Cross was the third member of the core team. He was a xenolinguist, 50 years old, thin and slightly hunched in the way of a man who had spent most of his life leaning over screens and documents. And he was exceptionally good at understanding not just what a species said, but what they meant when they said it. The gap between language and intent, which in interstellar communication was often very wide. He had studied the Council's communication style for 8 years. When Diane showed him the transmission, he read it once, set it down, and said, "They are not expecting a negotiation. They are expecting a response to a ruling." Ensign Claire Woods was 26 years old and had been Diane's aide for 14 months. She was precise, fast, and had a memory for details that Diane had come to rely on more than she sometimes wanted to admit. She prepared the travel documents, filed the mission request through Central Command, and arranged the crew manifest for their vessel, the ITV Harrington, which Captain Leon Hayes commanded, with the kind of quiet efficiency that Diane associated with people who were very comfortable being the least interesting person in any room. The Harrington departed Earth Dock on a Tuesday. The journey to Caravax Prime would take 11 days through 2 transit corridors. On the second day out, Claire found Price in the small observation lounge at the rear of the ship, sitting alone in the dark with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, staring at the stars the way people stare at things they are thinking about, rather than things they are actually seeing. "You're worried," she said. "I'm thinking," he said. "About the transmission?" He looked at her then. "About what the transmission means. About why 43 civilizations decided now was the right time to send it. About that border skirmish, and what the Council's enforcement vessel was actually doing near the Arvon corridor in the first place." He paused. "About the fact that they addressed it to the human species collectively, not to any government, not to Central Command, not to Earth's diplomatic office. Collectively." Claire thought about that. Like they wanted to make sure there was no one specific to blame the refusal on. Price looked at her steadily. Or like they wanted to make sure the answer would be binding. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in her bunk in the dim light of the Harrington's lower deck and thought about that word, binding, and what it meant when 43 civilizations used it. She thought about the council chamber she had seen in photographs, the tiered platforms, and the vast circular space designed to make every delegation feel the weight of the institution around them. She thought about Diane's calm and Price's stillness, and Dr. Cross's careful, measured readings of every word in that transmission. And she thought about something her mother had once told her, back when she was still in school and had asked why humans kept doing things that complicated their lives. Her mother had laughed and said, "Because we can't help it. It's just who we are." The Harrington moved through the dark between stars, steady and unhurried, carrying 5 human beings toward a chamber that held 43 civilizations and a document that none of them had read yet, a document that would, in 11 days, change the shape of the conversation entirely. Caravax Prime was not a planet. It was a station. But calling it a station was like calling the ocean a puddle. It was the size of a small moon, built over 900 years by a succession of council architects whose only common goal had been to make sure that every species who entered it understood immediately that they were very small and the institution was very large. It worked. When the Harrington came into docking range and Claire Woods pressed her face to the observation port to get a better look, she forgot for a moment to breathe. The station was dark metal and pale light, layered in concentric rings like something that had grown rather than been built. Dozens of vessels of different shapes and sizes moved around it in organized currents. The docking arms alone were longer than most human space stations. Dr. Cross, standing beside her, said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "They built this to remind you who has been here longer." Price, standing behind them both with his coffee, said, Good architecture. The human delegation was given a docking port on the outer ring, not the inner ring where the senior council species docked, not the mid-ring where the allied and observer species docked, the outer ring alongside cargo haulers and courier vessels. Diane said nothing about it. Price noticed and said nothing either, but Claire saw him file it away behind his eyes the same way she had seen him file things away during the entire voyage. Quietly, precisely, without comment. They were met by a Velhari escort, 3 tall figures in pale robes who guided them through corridors wide enough to fit a transport vehicle. The ceilings were high. The lighting was cool and blue-white, and everything was made to feel formal and permanent, the way a court of law feels formal and permanent. Not hostile exactly, but not warm either. A place where things were decided. The council chamber itself was circular. It rose in tiers from a central floor where the speaking podium stood, and the tiers curved upward and outward so that every delegation sat above the speaker and looked down. 43 platforms, each bearing the flag and colors of its species. 43 sets of eyes, or whatever the equivalent was, all aimed at the same floor. The human platform was on the lowest tier, not the second lowest, the lowest. There was one empty platform above theirs, and then the rest rose in an unbroken curve all the way to the ceiling. Claire leaned close to Diane and said, very quietly, "Is that on purpose?" Diane said, "Yes." High Speaker Ossevex was a tall creature with 6 limbs, 2 of which it used for walking, and 4 of which it kept folded against its body in a posture that Dr. Cross had told them during the voyage indicated formal authority. It spoke in the Council's common trade language, which the delegation's earpieces translated in real time. Its voice, even translated, had a quality like stone being moved across stone, slow, heavy, deliberate. It began with the list of human offenses. It read each one without hurry. Unsanctioned expansion into designated quiet zones. 6 incidents. Failure to register military vessels with the Council Registry. Ongoing, all vessels, for the entire duration of human spaceflight. Mining operations conducted without territorial deference protocols. 41 separate incidents. Interference with Council trade corridors. 9 incidents. And then last, and spoken with a slight shift in tone that Dr. Cross would later describe as something close to personal offense, the Arvon Corridor incident, in which a human patrol cutter had been issued a legal weapons lock by a Council enforcement vessel and had responded by firing first, disabling the enforcement vessel, and then, this was the part that seemed to bother Ossevex the most, filing a mission report that described the encounter as a successful defensive engagement. When Ossevex finished the list, the chamber was quiet. Then Councillor Vetharian rose. Vetharian was smaller than Ossevex, a species with pale orange skin and large dark eyes. And where Ossevex spoke like stone, Vetharian spoke like someone who had spent a long time learning to be reasonable. It presented the treaty. The document was long. Vetharian did not read all of it, but summarized the key points with the careful patience of someone who had written it and was proud of it. Human expansion would continue, but within zones approved by the Council. Human military vessels would be registered. Human mining operations would apply for territorial clearance. In exchange, humanity would receive full observer status in the Council, access to shared resource databases, and protection under Council law. It sounded, presented that way, almost generous. Diane asked for a recess to review the document in full. Ossevex granted 4 hours. In the small room assigned to the human delegation, plain walls, a table, 4 chairs, a water dispenser that dispensed something that was probably not water. Dr. Cross opened the document on his screen and began reading. Price sat with his arms folded and his eyes on the ceiling. Claire sat beside Cross and read over his shoulder. Diane stood by the wall with her hands clasped behind her back, very still. After 40 minutes, Dr. Cross said, "It is not a treaty." Price said, "No." "It is a transfer of authority," Cross said. "Dressed in the language of cooperation, but structurally not, we would be subordinate. Every decision regarding human military movement, resource extraction, and territorial expansion would require council approval. And approval timelines are not specified, which means they can delay indefinitely." Diane said, "Keep reading." 40 minutes after that, Claire found Appendix 7. She read it twice to make sure she had understood it correctly. Then she read it a third time. Then she said, in a voice that was very flat and very calm, "They can conscript our ships." Everyone looked at her. She turned her screen so they could all see it. Appendix 7. In the event of a galactic security emergency, the Council may requisition member vessels for collective defense purposes. A galactic security emergency is defined at the sole discretion of the Council. She paused. There is no limit on how many vessels. There is no time restriction on the requisition period. And the definition of the emergency is entirely theirs. The room was silent for a long time. Price unfolded his arms and leaned forward. He read Appendix 7 himself. Then he sat back and said nothing at all, which was, in Claire's experience, the loudest thing he ever did. Diane contacted Admiral Grace Foster at Earth Central Command on a secured channel. The transmission delay was 17 seconds each way, so the conversation moved slowly. Diane read Appendix 7 in full. She waited. 34 seconds later, Foster's voice came back. Foster was 61 years old and had commanded 3 fleet operations and one of the most complicated border negotiations in human history. She asked 2 questions. She waited for the answers. And then there was a pause, longer than the transmission delay, before her voice came back, clear and quiet. "Don't sign it." Diane looked at the others. Price was already nodding, barely, as though he had expected those exact words. Cross was staring at the document on his screen with an expression that mixed relief and anxiety in equal parts. Claire was watching Diane's face and thinking about what came next, about what walking back into that chamber meant, and what those 43 sets of eyes would look like when a species that had been seated on the lowest tier stood up and said something that no one in that room was ready to hear. The 4 hours ended. They walked back to the chamber. The Velhari escort was waiting. The corridors felt longer this time. The chamber filled back up the same way it had emptied. Slowly, deliberately. Each species taking its platform in an order that Dr. Cross had explained was itself a form of communication. The species with the longest council membership sat first. The newer members sat after. It was a way of reminding everyone, every single session, who had been here the longest and who had arrived most recently. The human delegation sat last on the lowest tier and waited. High Speaker Osavex took its place at the central podium and looked out across the chamber with the composed patience of a species that had been running this institution for 600 years. It announced that the recess had ended and asked the human delegation whether they were prepared to discuss the terms of the proposed agreement. Diane Cole stood up. She walked to the speaking floor alone. Price stayed in his seat. Claire stayed in her seat. Dr. Cross had his hands folded on the table in front of him and was watching Diane with an expression that was careful and still. The chamber was quiet in the way that large spaces full of attentive beings are quiet, not silent, but held. Diane reached the podium. She did not have notes. She had spent 2 of the 4 recess hours writing what she was going to say, and then spent the last hour deciding she did not need to write it down because it was a short thing to say, and she had been thinking it clearly enough for the words to have settled into her without needing paper to hold them. She looked up at the tiers. 43 species. Some she could identify by the colors of their delegations, some by their shapes, some by the way their atmospheric filters hummed faintly in the sealed sections of the platform, all of them watching her, a few with what she suspected was curiosity, Most with what she suspected was the satisfied expectation of people waiting for the outcome they had already planned for. She said, "The human delegation thanks the Galactic Council for the courtesy of this session, and for the time provided to review the proposed agreement." A pause. She let it sit. "We decline." The chamber did not erupt immediately. There was a moment, maybe 2 seconds, where nothing happened. And in that moment, Claire had the strange sensation of watching 43 civilizations try to process a word they had not prepared for. Then the sound came. Not shouting exactly, because most of the species present did not shout in the human sense, but a rising wave of sound. Clicks, tones, translated fragments through earpieces, the shuffling movement of bodies on platforms, the fast, low exchange of voices between delegation members who were asking each other whether they had heard correctly. Osvex raised one of its upper limbs and the chamber quieted, not all at once, but gradually, the way a fire dies down rather than goes out. "Ambassador Cole," it said, "please clarify. You are requesting amendments to the proposed agreement." "No," Diane said. "I am declining the agreement in its entirety, not specific clauses, not the appendices. The agreement as a whole. Earth will not be signing it." The chamber sound rose again. Osvex quieted it again, with more visible effort this time. "Ambassador," it said, and now its voice had a different quality. Still slow, still heavy, but with something underneath it that was not quite disbelief and not quite anger, but lived in the space between them. "This council has spent considerable time constructing a framework that accommodates human expansion while maintaining the stability of shared space. A complete refusal is not a response we anticipated." "I understand," Diane said, "and I want to be clear that this is not a refusal born of disrespect toward the Council or toward the civilizations represented here. Earth recognizes that our expansion has been fast. We recognize that it has caused disruption. We are willing to discuss ways to address specific concerns." She paused. "What we are not willing to do, and what we will not agree to in any form, is place command authority over human military forces in the hands of any external body. Not now, not in a modified version of this agreement, not at any future date." Vitharion rose from its platform. It did not wait to be recognized, which Claire noted was itself unusual. Its voice, translated, was tight. "Then what does humanity propose?" it said. "You come here, you reject the framework, you offer no alternative. What is it exactly that you want?" For the first time in the session, Price moved. He did not stand fully. He leaned forward in his chair and reached for the microphone on the delegation table, and he pulled it slightly toward him, and he said 4 words. "We want to be left alone." He said it the way he said most things, without raising his voice, without performance, without any visible awareness that what he was saying might land differently than a statement of fact. He said it because it was true and because it was the shortest accurate answer to the question that had been asked, and he saw no reason to dress it up. The silence that followed lasted 11 seconds. Dr. Cross counted them later from the recording. 11 full seconds in a chamber of 43 civilizations, yet where some form of sound was almost always present. The hum of atmospheric systems, the low tones of translation equipment, the ambient noise of hundreds of beings in a shared space. 11 seconds of something close to absolute quiet. Then Osvex said in a voice that was carefully controlled, "The Council will note the human delegation's position." There was a brief recess while the Council conferred internally. Diane returned to the delegation table. She sat down and looked at Price. He looked back at her. She said quietly, "That was either very good or very bad." "Yes," he said. When the Council reconvened, Osvex read the sanction declaration. Trade restrictions, effective immediately. Suspension of humanity's observer application. A formal notation of non-compliance in the Council record. and a statement that the Council would consider further measures should human activity continue to violate established protocols. The Velhari escort appeared at the edge of the delegation platform before Osivex had even finished reading, waiting to guide the human team back to their docking port. They walked the long corridors back to the outer ring in silence. Claire noticed that the ceilings, which had felt imposing on the way in, felt different now. Still high, still designed to make you feel small, but somehow less effective at doing it. She was not sure why. Nothing had changed about the architecture. The ceilings were the same height. The lighting was the same cool blue-white. The corridors were the same width. Maybe it was the fact that the thing they had been afraid of saying had now been said and the world had not ended. And they were still walking. Captain Hayes had the Harrington ready to depart when they arrived at the docking port. He asked no questions. He looked at Diane's face, and then at Price's, and then at Claire's. And then he simply said, "I'll get us underway." They cleared the docking arm and moved out through the outer ring currents and into open space, and for a while no one said anything. The great dark shape of Caravax Prime shrank behind them in the observation ports. Dr. Cross finally broke the quiet. "They will have a great deal to discuss tonight," he said. "So will we," Diane said. Price was looking at the stars. "Let them discuss," he said. "We said what we came to say." Claire sat in her seat and thought about those 11 seconds of silence and what they meant, and then what came next. Because something was definitely coming next. You did not tell 43 civilizations no, and then go home and sleep well. You went home, and you prepared. She looked at Price, and she could tell from the angle of his jaw and the steadiness of his eyes that he was already doing exactly that. The sanctions hit on a Wednesday. Back on Earth, the news traveled fast. By Thursday morning, the headlines were running the story in every language and on every platform. And by Thursday afternoon, the comment sections and public forums had split cleanly into two camps. Those who were angry at the Council and those who were angry at the delegation. Both camps were very loud. Neither camp was entirely wrong. The civilian government called an emergency session. Admiral Grace Foster sat at the long table in the Central Command briefing room with 7 other senior officers and 3 cabinet ministers and listened to the full impact assessment read out line by line. 4 council species had been supplying rare isotopes used in medical fabricators, specifically the kind used in emergency surgery systems on colonies and on vessels. Without those isotopes, the fabricators would continue to work for somewhere between 8 and 14 months on existing reserves before the quality of their output began to drop. 2 other council species had been serving as trade intermediaries for goods from the outer cluster. Materials that humans had not yet found a local source for, including a compound used in long-range drive systems. One of the cabinet ministers said, "We have roughly a year before this becomes a medical crisis." Foster said, "Then we have roughly a year to fix it." The minister looked at her. "You make it sound simple." "I make it sound like a problem with a timeline," Foster said. "Those are the best kind." She was not being naive. She understood the weight of what the sanctions meant. But she had spent her career watching human beings respond to problems with timelines, and she had a great deal of evidence for what happened next. What happened next was that people worked. And they did. Within 6 weeks of the sanctions announcement, the Earth Science Directorate had assembled a team of 41 chemists, materials engineers, and fabrication specialists whose sole assignment was to synthesize the 4 missing isotopes domestically. And it was not easy work. 2 of the isotopes required reaction conditions that pushed the limits of what current human equipment could do, and the first 3 months produced more failed batches than successful ones. But they kept working. By the end of the 5th month, they had successfully synthesized 2 of the 4 isotopes in quantities large enough to supply the colonial medical network. The other 2 remained a problem. The other 2 were solved not in a laboratory, but on a survey ship. A crew led by Lieutenant Dan Porter, conducting a mapping run through the Kepler corridor, found traces of the needed compounds on a moon that sat in a gap between designated council zones. Technically unclaimed, technically unregistered, and technically in the kind of space that the Council's protocols described as subject to pending classification. Humans read that phrase and saw a gap. They sent a mining team. The mining team set up operations within 3 weeks. The Council filed a formal notice of concern. Earth's legal office responded with a 40-page document explaining why the moon fell outside the scope of any existing territorial claim. The Council's legal office began preparing a counter-response. In the meantime, the mining team kept working. Dr. Alan Cross, reassigned from the diplomatic office to an economic advisory post, spent the months after the council session doing something he had not expected to find himself doing: making friends. Not formally, not through official channels, but through the slow and careful work of having long conversations with the representatives of civilizations that were not council members. There were more of those than most humans had realized. The council, for all its size and age, did not speak for every species in the local cluster. There were civilizations that had chosen not to join or had been overlooked, or had histories with the council that made membership complicated. Some of them had been watching humanity for years, with interest that they had kept quiet for reasons that became clear the longer Cross talked to them. The first direct trade agreement came from the Tavari, a species with 4 arms and a practical streak that Cross found immediately reassuring. The Tavari had compound resources that humans needed and wanted human fabrication technology that the Council had, though until now been quietly discouraging them from pursuing. The agreement was signed within 4 months of the sanctions. The second agreement, with the Marathi, followed 2 months after that. Neither agreement replaced what had been lost, but together they covered most of the gap, and more importantly, they were agreements between equals. No Appendix 7, no conscription clause, no timeline delays at the Council's discretion. On Caravax Prime, the Council watched. Vitharion received the adaptation reports from its monitoring office and read them with a growing discomfort that it did not immediately share with the full Council. The isotope synthesis, the mining operation on the Kepler moon, the trade agreements with non-member species. Each item taken alone was manageable. The problem was that they were not alone. They were a pattern. And the pattern described a species that, when presented with a wall, did not stop and reconsider its direction. It looked for the door, and if there was no door, it found the thinnest part of the wall and pushed through. Vitharion finally brought its concerns to the closed council session in the 7th month after the sanctions. It presented the adaptation data carefully because it knew the reaction it was going to get, and it wanted the data to speak before the opinions did. Some council members dismissed the concern. The sanctions were working as intended. They were costing humanity, and that was the point. The point was not to immediately change behavior, but to establish that behavior had consequences. Vitharion said, "The consequences are producing capability." The room did not like that framing, but it could not dismiss the data. The Arvon corridor incident was reviewed quietly, not in the full council session, but in a smaller meeting of military advisors from 6 of the larger council species. The recording of the engagement was analyzed carefully. A single human patrol cutter, a relatively small vessel, lightly armed by council standards, had been issued a weapons lock by a council enforcement cruiser 3 times its mass. The lock was a warning. Standard protocol dictated that the smaller vessels stand down and allow boarding. Instead, the human vessel had returned fire within 9 seconds of the lock signal, targeting the enforcement cruiser's drive systems with a precision that suggested either very good equipment or very good training or both. And had disabled the larger vessel before the cruiser's crew had completed their own firing sequence. The 6 military advisors produced a report. The report was filed under restricted access. What leaked out through a courier species that made a living carrying information between parties who did not want to be seen communicating directly was a single sentence from the summary. Engagement outcome is not consistent with expected parameters. Foster received that sentence through channels she did not officially have. She read it once. Then she called Price, who was back at his desk at Central Command, and read it to him over a secured line. Price was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good." "Is it?" Foster said. "It means they're asking the right questions," Price said. And they're not going to like the answers." The transmission arrived on a Monday morning, 14 months and 3 days after the council session on Caravax Prime. It came in on the standard diplomatic channel addressed, again, to the human species collectively. Foster's communications officer flagged it within seconds of receipt and had it on Foster's desk within 10 minutes. Foster read it standing up. She had a habit of reading things standing up when she was not sure how she felt about them yet. Sitting down felt too settled, too committed to a reaction before she had fully formed one. The transmission was from the Galactic Council, but it did not sound like the last one. The last one had been formal in the way of a legal document, structured, cold, with the precise language of an institution stating its authority. Yes, this one was formal in a different way. The structure was still there, the careful phrasing, the long sentences that built slowly toward their point. But underneath all of that, in the spaces between the clauses, was something that Foster recognized from long experience as the particular tone of a very proud entity that had just decided, for reasons it was not going to explain directly, that it needed to be slightly less proud. The Council wished to open a dialogue about a bilateral framework of mutual non-interference between the Galactic Council and the human species. It did not use the word treaty. It did not mention the registration requirement. It did not mention the territorial deference protocols. Appendix 7, the conscription clause, did not appear anywhere in the document, not even as a subject to be discussed. The Council proposed a meeting on neutral ground at a location to be determined by mutual agreement and stated that Earth was welcome to suggest the venue. Earth was welcome to suggest the venue. Foster set the document down on her desk and called Price. Price arrived at her office 20 minutes later. She handed him the printed copy without a word. He read it the way he read everything, once, completely, without stopping, and then he set it down and looked at the ceiling for a moment before looking back at her. "They blinked," he said. "Yes," Foster said. "The isotopes," he said. "The Kepler moon, the Tavari agreement, the Marathi agreement, the corridor report." He said each item the way someone counts items on a list, not with satisfaction, but with the flat precision of a person accounting for causes. They ran the numbers and the numbers came out wrong for them. "Probably," Foster said. She was quiet for a moment. "They're not going to say that, of course. The transmission doesn't say that. It sounds like a reasonable institution making a reasonable decision to pursue a more cooperative framework." "It always sounds like that," Price said. Foster picked up her stylus. She had a habit, when thinking through something important, of writing a single sentence that captured what she actually believed about the situation, not for anyone else's benefit, but as a way of making sure she knew where she stood before she started deciding what to do next. She wrote one sentence in the margin of the printed transmission in small, neat letters. She wrote, "Do not let this make us arrogant. It should make us careful." She looked at it for a moment, then set the stylus down and forwarded the transmission to the civilian government for formal review. Diane Cole received the forwarded copy at her home office. She read it at her kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold while she was reading. She had been in a quieter role since returning from Caravax Prime, not sidelined exactly, but given space that she suspected was meant to let the political temperature settle before she was put back in front of a camera. She did not mind. She had spent the 14 months writing a very long internal report about the council session that she suspected no one in Central Command had read in full, but that she had needed to write anyway, because she needed to understand what had happened and why and what she thought about it. She thought about it now. The rejection had been right. She had not been sure, not fully sure, not in the moments immediately after, when she had walked the long corridors of Caravax Prime, with sanctions ringing in her ears and the weight of 43 civilizations' displeasure pressing at her from the direction they had come from. But she was sure now. You could not sign away command authority. You could not let a clause like Appendix 7 sit at the bottom of a document and call it an agreement. The word agreement meant something. It meant two parties who both gained something. Appendix 7 was not a gain. It was a trap that looked like a formality. She wrote back to Foster, "I am available whenever you need me." Foster wrote back 3 hours later, "Good. Start thinking about venues." On the Harrington, which was 3 weeks into a survey run near the Kepler corridor, Lieutenant Claire Woods was standing at the observation window on the ship's lower deck when the message came through from Central Command, summarizing the second transmission. Hayes read it over the intercom to the crew in his usual quiet voice, the same voice he used for departure clearances and maintenance schedules, as if the return of the Galactic Council with a request instead of an order was a routine operational development that everyone should note and then go back to work. Claire stayed at the window. Outside, a few thousand kilometers away, the mining barge assigned to the Kepler moon was making its slow way back from an extraction run, heavy with ore, navigation lights blinking in a steady, patient rhythm. It was an ugly vessel. It was loud and slow, and it smelled, when you got close enough, of processed rock and recycled coolant. It was not glamorous. It was not the kind of ship that featured in stories about humanity reaching for the stars. It was the kind of ship that went somewhere useful and picked up something needed and came back and did it again. Claire thought about the council chamber on Caravax Prime. She thought about the lowest tier and the cool blue-white corridors and the 11 seconds of silence. She thought about what Vitharion had asked. What does humanity propose? And about Price leaning toward the microphone and saying 4 words that had filled that silence the way a key fills a lock. She thought about the mining barge and the Tavari agreement and the synthesized isotopes and the Kepler moon that was not supposed to be accessible and the survey ship that had found it anyway, because someone had looked at the map and seen a gap and gone to look. 14 months ago, a room full of ancient civilizations had told humanity what it would do. They had presented a document and a deadline and a platform on the lowest tier and the settled expectation of a species that had been managing younger civilizations for centuries and knew exactly how this conversation was supposed to go. And humanity had looked at all of that. At the centuries and the tiers and the appendices and the patient institutional weight of 43 species, and had said no, not loudly, not angrily, not with a list of counter-demands or an alternative proposal or a face-saving exit. Just no, clearly, without hesitation, the way you say no to something you have already decided about before the question was finished. Claire watched the mining barge blink its way back toward the moon and thought, that is the most human thing we have ever done. Not the defiance, not the part where they held firm or walked out or refused to be impressed by the size of the station. Those things were true, but they were not the center of it. The center of it was simpler than that. The center of it was the complete and total absence, in that chamber, of the moment where they looked at the treaty and thought, maybe we should just sign it. That moment had never come. Not for Diane, not for Price, not for Cross, not for Foster on the other end of the secured channel. It had simply not occurred to any of them as a real option. They had read Appendix 7, and that had been the end of it, as if the answer had been waiting there the whole time, and the only thing the question had done was confirm it. Claire stayed at the observation window until the mining barge had disappeared around the dark curve of the moon. Then she went back to her post. The Harrington had work to do. There were gaps in the map that still needed filling, and humanity, as it always had, was moving toward them.